Based on historical precedent, the typical powers inherent in central banking practice include the control of interest rates and the expansion and contraction of the money supply itself. Now, the central bank does not simply issue money to the government, it loans it to them with interest. Then, through the mechanisms of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank essentially regulates the value of the currency issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system could only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out. For every single dollar produced by both the central bank and its regulated commercial banks is loaned at interest. That means every dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percentage of debt based on that dollar. And since the banking system has the monopoly of the production of the currency, and they loan each dollar out with an immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the banks again, which means the banking system has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which, in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system is essentially slavery, for it is technically impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt.
And since I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity, meaning your great-great-grandchildren they're going to pay for that, under the name of funding, is but swindling futurity of on a large scale. They're basically saying that we're going to get money to fund stuff, but we're just screwing over our great-grandchildren. That was Thomas Jefferson. Letter to John Taylor. Banking was conceived in inequity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. If you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money. This is Sir Joseph Stamp, University of Texas speech.
By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were maneuvered into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push, once again, legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by reportedly creating rumors that prominent banks in New York were insolvent or bankrupt.
And keep in mind, this story, okay, not the rest of the stories, this first one about the Panic of 1907, this is exactly how they tell them in the books that they have in public schools. You know what I mean? Today, I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. They probably changed it a little bit. But this actually was in the other stories he's going to go into. I don't think they're all in the. I don't think I learned that in high school, like a public school. But I learned it in the hundreds of millions of other books that talk about, because that's how you learn history. You go to the public schools, and whatever books they have, you ignore and go away from them, run from them.
Morgan knew this would trigger mass hysteria and a climate crisis, and it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together years later, Congressman Charles Lindbergh wrote, "The King bankers put in motion in 1907 a great scheme. They had gambled and speculated on Wall Street until so many watered stocks and bonds had been manufactured. The King bankers knew the condition and informed the favorite of their friends what was to come. There was to be a panic in the fall of 1907, and it would be advertised as the result of our bad banking and currency laws. The panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the financial powers and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission led by Aldrich recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark that the bankers needed to initiate their plan. And in 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge, that most of the figures who attended disguised their names when en route to the island.
See, this is what they did. They caused the panic in 1907, or whatever year it was. They destroyed everyone. They destroyed the entire economy just to get the Federal Reserve Bank and to make a buck. When they already have all the money in the world anyway. Why do they have to? Why?
The island. And after this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And a few days before Christmas, when much of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. The night before its passage, Congressman Charles Lindbergh pleaded, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power will be legalized." Now, the public was told that the Federal Reserve System was an economic stabilizer, and inflation and economic crises were a thing of the past. Well, as history has shown, nothing was further from the truth. The fact is, the bankers now had a streamlined machine for economic manipulation. For example, from 1914 to 1919, the Fed substantially increased the money supply, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then, in 1920, the Fed deliberately contracted credit in an extreme way, thus resulting in banks having to call in large numbers of loans, and, just like 1907, bank runs, bankruptcy, and systemic collapse occurred. Numerous competitive banks outside of the Federal Reserve System collapsed, further consolidating the monopoly of the money trust cartel. Privy to this scheme, Congressman Lindbergh pronounced, "Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out as we figure a mathematical equation." However, the panic of 1920 was just a warm-up. From 1921 to 1929, the Fed again increased the money supply, resulting once again in extensive loans to the public and banks. There was also a fairly new type of loan in the stock market, the broker call loan. Very simply, this loan allowed an investor to put down only a fraction of the stock's value, with the rest being loaned from the broker. This method was very popular in the roaring 1920s, as everyone seemed to be making money in the market. However, there was a catch to this loan. It could be called in at any time and had to be paid within 24 hours. And the typical result was the selling of the stock purchased with that loan. So, a few months before October in 1929, J.D. Rockefeller, Bernard Baruch, and many other insiders quietly exited the market, knowing the bubble created was about to burst. Then, on October 24th, 1929, the financiers who furnished the call loans started calling them in masse. This sparked an instantaneous massive sell-off in the already inflated market, as sell orders and margin calls were systemically triggered. That then led to mass bank runs, eventually collapsing thousands of banks, enabling the large banks to buy up the now failed banks at a discount. But it didn't stop there. Rather than expanding the money supply in order to recover from this economic collapse, the Fed actually contracted it, fueling one of the largest depressions in American history. Outraged, Congressman Louis McFadden, then chairman of the House Banking Committee, filed a petition for impeachment against the Federal Reserve Board. stating, "Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of that law by the Federal Reserve Board, and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it." Now, having reduced the society to squalor, it was then decided that the gold standard should be removed. In order to do this, they needed to acquire the remaining gold in the system. So, under the pretense of helping to end the Depression, came the 1933 gold seizure. Under the threat of imprisonment for 10 years, everyone in America was required to turn in all gold bullion to the Treasury, essentially robbing the public of what little wealth they had left. And at the end of 1933, the gold standard was abolished. If you look at a dollar bill before 1933, it says it is redeemable in gold. If you look at the dollar bill today, it says it is legal tender, which means it is backed by absolutely nothing. The only thing that gives our money value is the public faith and how much of it is in circulation. Therefore, the power to regulate the money supply is also the power to regulate its value, which is also the power to manipulate and control entire economies.
It says whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. Because, like I said, you can flood the market and then everything is regular, right? Then they contract it and they call in all the loans, everyone, banks go, people get nervous and take all their money out of the banks, and what happens is all the property goes down in value, right? Because there's not as much money. You got to think of the volume of money in a society. This is just an analogy, okay? It's all, it's more complex than this. But I want you to think of this: no matter how much money you have in your society, it's always going to equal the same thing. Like, let's say all your money in your society represents what you can buy in the whole country, right? If you double the money supply, then all the money in the money supply still can only buy you what's in the entire country. If you triple the money supply, well, now everything in your society has doubled in value. But what if you take the money supply and you take it in half? Okay? Now you can still buy everything in your society, but only with that half, that it's still equal to the same thing. That's why when they give you money, like all this stuff, they gave you trillions back when there was COVID or whatever. All they did was they gave you a bunch of money, and whatever money they gave you, the value, because you're just printing up money, it doesn't have any value. It takes its value from all the money in the country. You know what I mean? Like, let's say I double the supply of the money, right? So I have $100 in society. Now I have $200, right? And they both buy the same thing. Let's say a computer. One day I got $100 in society. It buys one computer. Double the money supply. Now I have $200 in society, but it still only buys that computer. So if they give us stimulus checks and they doubled the volume of money, right? Everything in your society will double in value. So if you had $10 one day, $100, they didn't give you anything. When they give you stimulus checks, they give you nothing, because whatever money they gave out, that percentage is what goes up in society on the prices of stuff, you idiots. But now you're in more debt, right? Because you borrowed money to do these stimulus checks. And on top of that, what happens the next month? Okay, they doubled the supply of the money from $100 to $200, right? The computer is now, you can't buy it for $100, you got to pay $200, so you're screwed, right? Everything's doubled. But what about the next month? Unless the stimulus check goes on forever, the next month, the inflation created by creating money, you know what I mean? It's still there. So the prices are still doubled, but your income hasn't doubled. You just got a free check from the government, your stimulus check. So now now for a year or two, you got to live with this inflation, right? So you didn't get anything. You got nothing. You got screwed, you idiots. Why do you ask money? You should never ask for money from the government. That's so stupid.